Dialogue at the Wilson Center is a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And now here's your host, John Molesky.
Hello and welcome to the Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. This week, we turn our attention to China's rise, specifically the environmental implications of its rapid growth. Our guests are Jennifer Turner, director of the Wilson Center's China Environment Forum, and Craig Simons, a former Asia bureau chief for Cox Newspapers and a Newsweek China correspondent who has written this new book, The Devouring Dragon: How China's Rise Threatens Our Natural World. Jennifer, Craig, welcome to the program. Thanks for joining us.
Lovely to be here.
Craig, I want to start with a little bit of scale. Whenever I think of China myself, and then when I read the early passages in your book, it speaks to the fact that we're talking about something very large. From the book, you say 1/5 of humanity, 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gases, half of the world's coal burned in China. Expand on this notion of the scope of the country that you're covering in this endeavor.
Right. Yeah, I think for a Western audience, often understanding the scale, both the scale of China and the speed of China's development is a challenge. But it is, 19% of the world's population, now roughly half of the world's coal consumed every year. Enormous impacts in all kinds of areas. So getting a sense of that size and the speed of the growth, we're looking at 30 years now of roughly 10% annual GDP growth. So just an enormous trajectory of increased consumption of all kinds of things. And it's not, nothing unusual in the world. We've all, our own nation and Western nations know the same kind of trajectory. We all, we followed a similar path to getting richer. But because of the speed of China's growth and the size of the population, it's having a larger impact than we did.
Jennifer, I want to ask you, when we talk statistically, people can glaze over. It's tough to create a human context.
Yeah.
When you think about China in this regard, both in terms of size and the second element that's most prominent, speed, the rapid development that's taking place, how do you think about it in a way that makes it manageable for you to understand it?
Well, I think that, some of the numbers can help, though. The fact that, that China and all of our Chinese friends that say, like, wow, it's changed a lot, we're getting richer, and our cities are expanding. So let's look at the city question. In the next 15 years, China's going to urbanize another 350 million people. That's about as many people that are in the United States. And they're doing that not simply because they love cement and they love cities, but that it's a question of pulling up the people out of poverty. And then a lot of this is going to be, it's not just the rural people moving to the cities. I like thinking of it, the cities are moving to the rural areas. There are cities growing all over China.
But even in the internet age where people can telecommute, it's cities still create the economic engines.
They're the economic engines, and farm life is not horribly comfortable, and there's not a lot of money to be made. Cities have been a pull throughout human history. But because of this growth in cities, and also China's continued role as the world's factory, their energy consumption has tripled between 2000 and
we can look up the numbers.
The numbers
are always.
But I believe it's tripled since the mid 1990s to today, and it's likely to double again by 2020. And that's it's to fuel the growth of both China's internal development, but also their exports. They are our factory, and so that China as the devouring dragon. It's about the devouring earth, and that we are consuming the products that they're producing and processing.
I have that number actually. So according to the International Energy Agency, it's China's energy consumption. This is total, not just electricity.
Yeah.
But it nearly tripled between 1990 and 2009.
Yeah.
Wow. And timing is everything, and you make the point in the book that China's hitting its stride while the planet may be reaching a tipping point environmentally. Could you expand on that idea?
Sure. The tipping point idea is, scientists have talked about the potential of humans to sort of outstrip the planet or live unsustainably for a long time. And this goes back to Malthus in just before 1800. But it looks like now, we have reached some points where humanity has gotten large enough and our consumptive desires have gotten large enough that we are sort of moving into very unsustainable territory, right? And so in 2000, I think one of the more interesting studies was the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment by the UN. It was put out in 2000. They brought together a large number of scientists to look at reports, and they found that of, I believe it was 26 what they called ecosystem services. These are things like the basic health of the land and water. We were using 16 of them at an unsustainable rate. And that was in 2000, and we've gone 13 years from there. And it's not just China that's developing. In the book I talk about China because that's where I've lived for 13 years, and I wanted to focus on what it means that China is developing so rapidly. But behind China, there's India, and there's Brazil, and there's everybody else. So how do we live in a world that is expected to reach 10 billion people by the end of the century, where people are living lives that are somewhat like what we live in the West? Is that possible, and what do we need to think about to make that happen in a sustainable way?
Can you begin to, and while we make clear we're not picking on China, because you just made clear that we're all in this together, yet you're focusing on China, so we'll talk about it.
Sure.
If you could help us quantify the destruction that is occurring as a result of, either directly or indirectly as a result of China's rapid rise, what are some specific examples of things that are breaking down, whether it be biodiversity or air pollution? What are the types of things you can share with us?
Yeah, so in this book I focus primarily on 3 areas. One is China's impact on forests. The second is China's impact on biodiversity. And the third is China's impact on climate. So with forests, China began importing a lot of timber after some bad flooding of the Yangtze River in 1998. It now, according to some research, it imports roughly half of the world's tropical timber. So I looked a lot at old growth forests. These are the world's remaining forests that have been around, primarily untouched from what they've always been, and there's not a lot of that left. So a lot of those forest products now, those trees are being cut down for export to China. With climate change, I think that's a story that we know a bit better. But China now emits, according to a recent study, something like 26% of the world's carbon dioxide, anthropogenic emissions of carbon dioxide. And those emissions are expected to grow as Chinese continue to get richer and enjoy the prosperity that the life has brought them. The biodiversity, China is now considered the top importer of a number of animal parts, and a lot of this dates back. This is a little bit harder for a Western audience to understand because it's cultural and it's rooted in thousands of years of tradition. But traditional Chinese medicine created a desire among a certain part of the population for things like rhino horn or tiger bone, and given the large population, even if you have a minuscule part of the population that actually wants to use this stuff,
it's a lot of people.
It's a lot of people, and it's a lot of impact.
Well, and the cultural aspect also, not just medicine, but you write about what Chinese people eat. And you talk about an old Chinese joke. Could you share that with us about if it has 4 legs, eat it. If it's not the table, and what's the rest of
the Chinese? So they'll talk about they'll eat anything on the land that has anything that has 4 legs, but a table. Anything that's in the air, but an airplane. There are different versions of this. Anything in the water, but a boat.
Yeah.
And that's in some areas of China that is true. People want to try new foods. There's a history of wanting to eat wild products because it's seen as safer. It's unique. We've certainly gone through some of that in the United States, where people have eaten things that might be considered weird to others.
Sure.
But yeah.
I'm sorry, Jeff.
Well, there's one of the species you probably are talking about in your book too is the pangolin, which is a scaly anteater. I had never heard of it until I started working at the Wilson Center and had bringing people from WWF in.
We have some pet pangolins here.
Well, the pangolin, it's a meat that is believed to be really helpful for women who are nursing or who are pregnant. And what was striking to me is that what over the years I've learned that the Chinese government and the Public Security Bureau is really working with international organizations, CITES and Traffic, to help stop the illegal smuggling of pangolins from Southeast Asia into China. And so the smugglers, frustrated that the Chinese have become so efficient at it, now built plants where they process the pangolin meat. So instead of just throwing them in the truck and driving them across the border, they make packages of meat and label it as pork or some other meat, and they drive it on in. And that the traditional Chinese medicine associations in China have been saying that yes, it's true, we shouldn't eat endangered species and whatnot, but this issue of pangolin meat, it's just really deeply ingrained in the culture. And
right. So it's a hard thing sometimes to understand where that desire to eat something like a pangolin comes from, but it is, this is a long cultural history.
Well, you write about Confucian ideology and how it shapes some of these attitudes. Could you talk to us a bit about that?
Sure.
And also, and I'd get both of you to weigh in on that. Culturally, what are the other barriers to addressing some of these environmental problems? The Communist Party also is something you touch on in the book as a barrier because of its inability to process criticism in a constructive manner. So if both of you could weigh in on where the Chinese people are on this, and if there is a foothold perhaps for progress, pressure from the ground up, and then also what are the barriers? We've addressed a couple during our discussion so far, barriers to making progress or being more aggressive in continuing to grow without leaving a wake of destruction.
Sure. The Chinese people are very concerned about environmental issues, domestic environmental issues, increasingly global environmental issues, including climate change. The government is very concerned about these issues. Sometimes the problem is enforcement at a local level, and that's where I talked about the Confucian model, which is traditionally China is a top-down kind of model where the government will make a decision, and that would be passed down to the lower levels, and at the local level they're supposed to enforce that decision. Well, if the local level, if their prerogative is to build the economy, sometimes that takes priority, and they don't necessarily enforce all of those environmental regulations that might slow down economic growth. That's what I mean with a sort of a top-down Confucian model, and how it could be an impediment to enacting environmental protections.
But that said, today, he gave a talk this morning at the China Environment Forum, happily, and we talked about also
Was it recorded for a webcast?
It wasn't recorded for webcast
because I would tell our viewers they could watch that.
I'm so
You'll
sorry.
have to just settle for dialogue here.
Settle for dialogue. There's a good settlement here. But that you have this big hunger for resources, but at the same time, it seems like a contradiction, but it's another trajectory of China. The Chinese government, one-party system, sometimes can enforce what I call the environmental authoritarianism. They said, 6-7 years ago, we need to be more energy efficient, and they revised the 11th five-year plan. They had laws, they had campaigns, and China really has made a lot of progress in becoming much more energy efficient. Energy efficiency is not a very sexy story to tell, but they've also promoted renewable energy, and they've got the largest, I don't know if you say wind turbines are a fleet, but the largest fleet of wind power in the world right now, and it's very impressive.
How we hear a lot about this, both in U.S. politics, and now we're hearing it from you about China. This whole notion of I'll call it a green economy,
or the green energy revolution.
Well, give us some sense of how imminent that significant breakthroughs can occur here. This could be the ultimate game changer, correct? If the science improves exponentially and not on some slow graph.
Well,
right? And how soon are we? Is this a pipe dream, or are we on the verge of something significant here?
Well, China has, a lot of the international companies that focus on all kinds of renewable energies, they've moved their manufacturing and their research centers to China because China has created a market. They have the laws, they have the feed-in tariffs, and business goes where they have an assurance of the market. And China is not just looking to produce this renewable energy for their own country, but for the region and the world as a whole. They're the main producer of solar PV panels, for example, but they themselves have not installed a lot.
What I'm asking is how quickly what you just described, how quickly does this reduce that half of the world's coal being burned in China?
Then I was just getting to that. Even though they're going like
right.
gangbusters on renewable energy, and they're also building nuclear power plants faster than any country in the world ever has. We can argue whether or not that's green or not, but that is happening, and it's happening because they want to reduce their CO2 emissions. But at the same time, their electricity needs are still growing phenomenally fast, and coal still is projected to be at least 70% of their energy. And so it's a tough nut that even though they are by leaps and bounds, but with the technology that's on the shelf that they're using for clean energy, it still is not enough to slow down the coal.
Right. So you can have both at the same time.
Yeah.
You can have China both emitting a lot more carbon dioxide, but also pushing the world into a more green, pushing forward green technologies.
And bringing down the costs of those
Bringing down the
technologies.
cost. Yeah, just a couple points. In 2009, according to quite a bit of research, China surpassed the U.S. as the world leader in clean energy finance and investment. It's now the biggest market for wind turbines in the world, and it's really pushed down the cost of manufacturing solar panels and wind turbines, so making it more affordable.
You mentioned that Chinese people and Chinese government are both concerned about climate change. Is there anything of the equivalent of global warming deniers that we have in American politics, in Chinese politics?
No. I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, that saying that that the Chinese government doesn't deny it. They put it in their most recent 12 5-year plan that certain percentages reducing CO2 emissions with GDP growth and but every major plan is supposed to incorporate CO2 emissions. Now, implementation can be dodgy, but the energy side, because China knows if they can't keep the energy flowing, the economy can't flow, and the government's legitimacy is gone. But at the same time, there's the contradiction of still depending on coal, because again, coal keeps the lights on.
Amidst all the gloom and doom, disappearing biodiversity and unbreathable air, you end on an optimistic note. At the end of the book, you quote Columbia University economist Jeffrey Sachs about if we invest 2 to 3% annually of world income, we can create something sustainable. Can you speak to that? Could you give us what that translates into? And is that anything that's even on the agenda?
Yeah, I think at some point it will be on the agenda for governments around the world, not just for China, because the environment is likely to degrade to a point where we have to make decisions that cause us to live more sustainably.
What will it take? In other words, we've seen killer storms, and that some people tie to climate change, and it's hard to make that a direct one-to-one link, but more moisture in the oceans creates more fuel for storms. What do you think it will take for us to put that on the agenda as we've discussed it?
I think that's prognostication. We don't know. I mean, we don't know what it's going to take and how bad things might get before people decide and to make those kinds of changes. There are economic costs, which is why they haven't been made so far. But I think at some point in the future, people will begin to make those choices. And in my book, I wanted to end on an optimistic note, which is, even though we face these problems, there's a lot left to be saved in the world, and there's a lot of reasons that we should try to go out and think about things like protecting tigers. 4,000 tigers remain in the wild, and people are worried that they could go extinct if we don't do more to save them, or protecting the last pockets of untouched old-growth forest. Now, it's true that a lot of these are now in some jeopardy, but they're still there, and if we decide as a global community to work to save them, I think it's possible, and China will have to be part of that discussion because they're such a big part of the consumption.
And for China watchers, where does the optimism come from as we look at this scenario?
Well, I think that what keeps me optimistic on this topic in particular is that in the past few years, that both the foundation world, the NGOs, and the researchers outside of China, and then now increasing in China, are starting to look at this Chinese overseas footprint, and that you have organizations like World Resource Institute and others engaging with Chinese government and Chinese businesses. We had a meeting last year which Friends of the Earth and Brookings and Heritage Foundation folks came and talked about some of the positive trends of Chinese businesses realizing that they want to be, these are the big oil companies, the Sino-Hydro, big dam builder. They're actually concerned about their face on the global stage in terms of being a multinational, and that there are examples where it seems shocking that Sino-Hydro and big oil companies have said no. They said, when I think it was the Ugandan government wanted a Chinese oil company to drill in what was a World Heritage Site, and they said, it's a World Heritage Site, we can't drill there. And so that there is this kind of consciousness raising within the Chinese business community as they, again, China opened up to the world to sell stuff, and now they're going out and investing, and the companies are seeing it as a potential risk. I know you didn't deal as much with the oil and dam building in your book, but but the question about in the countries where the Chinese are extracting the resources, like you were in Papua New Guinea, was it that was, they were okay, they were receptive to the Chinese.
And forgive me
investment?
for being the time cop, but we have only about 30 seconds
Oh,
for you to
sorry.
respond to that big
Okay.
question.
Sorry,
No, that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of these communities, people want the same things that we want in the West. They want material, good, comfortable material lives. They want vehicles. They want homes. They want the things that we've gotten used to here, and they're happy often for the opportunity to sell natural resources to have some of that life. And that's where I get back to the idea that we're all in this together, because it's a global marketplace. It just happens that China is coming along with so many people growing so quickly and really raising the metabolism of global environmental change, if you will.
Well, that's a good final statement for a big discussion. And thanks to both of you for joining
you so
us.
much.
Enjoyed it. And the book is terrific, The Devouring Dragon. This is it. I recommend you read it after you've watched the program. And after the break, Oxford University professor Paul Collier joins us addressing global poverty through social enterprise. Right after this.
The Wilson Center is America's living memorial to its 28th president, connecting the world of policymaking to practical options derived from the world's finest ideas, research, analysis, and honest, nonpartisan conversation. Visit us on the web at wilsoncenter.org. And now we return to more dialogue at the Wilson Center.
Welcome back. At a recent conference on global development goals, there was lots of discussion around the concept of social entrepreneurship, or as our guest Paul Collier refers to it, social enterprise. Author and Oxford professor Paul Collier provides context. With the deadline for Millennium Development Goals approaching, what's your evaluation of progress, and what suggestions can you offer for future goals?
It's an opportunity to get a new focus globally on what should be the objectives of efforts on development. And the old Millennium Development Goals, I think, achieved quite a lot, and so we don't want to throw them out. I'd summarise them as being about floors to decent living standards. And for the 21st century, it's appropriate to have some idea of floors to decent living standards. But I don't think that's enough for the 21st century. I think since those MDGs were created, there's been a rising awareness of, if you like, the environmental limits to growth, and so some sense that we're stewards of natural assets and can also generate natural liabilities in carbon if we're not careful. So some notion of stewardship of nature, I think, is a second cluster, if you like. Floors to living standards, stewardship of nature. And then I'd say the third cluster that was spectacularly missing from the MDGs is something around, I'd call it jobs and justice. It's the dignity of people as participants rather than as recipients. If you think about the Arab Spring, it was an expression of frustration that people didn't have any political rights, and so no justice, and a frustration that they didn't have jobs, not participants in economic prosperity. It's not enough to have public spending coming down. You've actually got to be, a successful economy is giving you a livelihood. So that's my suggestion, is kind of three clusters. One around floors to living standards, one around stewardship of nature, custodians of nature, and one around jobs and justice.
How does the notion of growth factor into the equation when you also consider environmental concerns?
You know, some nice things are better tackled in an oblique way. One of the disasters of corporate mismanagement of the last 20 years was when companies switched their mission statements from things like, we're going to be the best chemical company in the world, to we're going to maximize shareholder value. Shareholder value is something that's best achieved indirectly through focusing on some more meaningful objective. And it's the same with growth. Prosperity, of course, is desirable. That shouldn't be a stated, monitorable goal. You get there by doing things like jobs, by having people participate, both as producers as well as consumers, by having floors to decency, and by good stewardship of the natural assets. So it's better to think of growth as something that is an outcome, not the ultimate outcome, but an outcome, a consequence an array of things that it's better to focus on.
What then do you see as the ultimate potential of social entrepreneurship?
I think if we shift the focus of why are people poor from, there've been kind of a few vintages of theory. Vintage one was to say poor countries are poor because they're short of capital. But that can't be the end of the story, because they're short of capital because of something. Capital moves. Huh? And then vintage two would say, well, they're poor because they've got poor policies. And we know that can't be the end of the story. Policies are the outcome of a political process. So vintage three was to say countries are poor because they've got dysfunctional institutions, political institutions, which mean that the state doesn't have an incentive to meet the needs of ordinary people. And that's kind of about where the global diagnostics have got to. But even that's a very limited perspective, because what it misses is the fact that it's not all just institutions. There are organizations which turn people into, determine whether people are productive or not. Business organizations and public organizations. Now, if you look at Africa, the typical business organization is much too small to be productive. It can't reap scale economies. The typical public organization is big, but it's failed to reap to turn people productive because it's mismanaged worker motivation, it's mismanaged cooperation and coordination. And so an effective organization is one which reconciles scale and specialization with keeping people motivated and coordinated. That's what a good social enterprise does. If it can do that, it's got a really big potential.
New editions of Context can be found each week at wilsoncenter.org, and previous episodes are available at wilsoncenter.org/context. That's all for this edition of Dialogue at the Wilson Center. Until next week, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Television and Radio. Our host's Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Molesky. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.